So you said something about transitioning to Google.
Google, yeah. So tell us, we've talked a lot about your learning curve and some of the mistakes and things that you learned through. How does that all roll up into the success with
Well,
Google and
so I was talking a little bit about that. So I met Mark Cuban 2000, 2001 when they were on their like third round of funding. They were, they were trying to become the de facto standard, and they thought that what would give them the leverage to be that standard, that codec, so that everyone would download their player instead of the real player or Microsoft player, is if they tied up the agreements with the top couple hundred NCAA Division I schools, so they could basically stream their football, basketball, hockey, whatever, all the different games. And this is before satellites really taken off. There's really no other way to get this kind of content at that time. And so he cut a deal with 200 stations that had the rights to play those games locally, but there was no way to get it beyond that local market. And they basically determined, even though it wasn't covered by the agreement, that because they had those rights, that the radio station also owned those rights to the stream, which no one had even thought of would ever exist at that time. So based on the strength of that agreement, he sold the company to Yahoo like 6 months later for $5 billion before he could ever monetize it. Just basically saying, I got the leverage, I got this content that everyone's going to want. And so he sold it. And Yahoo thought also that would give them the ability to have that standard for that player for the streaming content. Anyway, radio at that time was an $18 billion market. So here you have an industry with 10,000 radio stations in the United States, and all their revenue combined is $18 billion. And you got Mark Cuban, who sells his company for $5 billion for the rights to streaming rights to 200 stations, right, that he didn't even own. And radio didn't get a nickel. So that's when the whole radio formed a consortium, and they banded together, and they basically said, we're not going to work with outsiders. We need to figure this stuff out on our own, because these guys are coming in and stealing our assets and our value. They didn't own a stick. They didn't own the talent. They didn't own the station. They're not paying any of the staff. They don't have to work with the, FCC and all the, and they made $5 billion on a piece of paper. And so they were just fed up. And Mel Karmazin's the one that kind of drove that bandwagon. I don't see you guys. Do you hear me?
Yeah, you're perfect. We see you.
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know. I must have a bandwidth issue on mine. You guys just went dark, but as long as you can hear me. So what happens is I've sold my company. I fly to New York. I meet at the Harvard Club. It's an annual event where all the radio owner groups are there. All of the PE groups and venture groups, all the money that's in the radio industry is there. Basically the whole financial community, all the top agencies in the country are there. And this is where they sit down and they basically look at all the numbers and stats of the last year, everything that's going to go on in the next year, where the capital needs are, where the growth is, where the formats are, what's the trends in advertising. It's basically all the top guys, all arm wrestling over the way things are going to go into the future. Analysts are all there. And while I'm there, I meet these guys that I knew in Orange County, and they had written the first ad serving technology that decentralized ad serving, so that, in the very beginning, when Yahoo and Netscape and GeoCities and all these sites first launched, that there were no ads on them. And they created that technology and centralized it in a way where you could follow the advertiser around. And so they took that company public and ended up selling it for $1 billion. And they're getting into the radio industry, and they're thinking, radio has 10,000 stations and they have 10,000 ad servers. They're the way the internet used to be. They haven't figured out this economy of scale where you can serve the ads to all the stations from a single location and have all these efficiencies as a part of that, and have it scale so that when a national advertiser needed to get on 200 stations, he didn't have to negotiate 200 contracts. It could all be done centrally. Anyway, I run into them. These guys had this patent for this technology, and they've been trying to bang on the door for radio for 2 years, and radio wouldn't answer their door. And they see me on the way out. I'm going to go to London the next day to introduce my replacement to all the radio heads over there. And they looked at me and said, you need to join our team, because we got the one thing that we think is going to revolutionize the radio industry. CPMs on radio were actually lower than television and newspaper. And so they thought this is the one thing that could make radio more valuable than all the other medias. And, you know, we want to save radio, but they won't listen to us. So anyway, long story short, I ended up doing a deal with them. I came on as the chief marketing officer. I came on as an equity shareholder. I insisted that I get on. And it's funny, they're investors because they had already done a $1 billion deal. Their investors were hedge fund, which typically don't do deals like this. They don't do venture type deals. Hedge funds have to have a lot of liquidity in a deal because that's the whole meaning of hedge. They like to go long and short and make the money on the in between, right? But in this particular case, they created a separate fund and changed the bylaws so they could be in this deal. So they fought pretty hard to keep anybody out of it. They were pretty excited about its potential. But anyway, I came on as an optionee holder and an equity holder and sat on the board. And my job was within 12 months to get them into 800 radio stations, and that we would have the patents and the leverage and be at this tipping point where they believed we would sell to Google, Yahoo, or Microsoft for over $1 billion. At that time, I had already ridden through the dot-com blow up, and I'm thinking $1 billion deals are done. But I thought, hey, we're valuing it at $60 million. If we sold for $300 million, that's a 5Xer. I'm happy with that, right? Well, I kid you not, a year later, me, having had worked for a decade with all these radio heads, was able to get us into a couple thousand radio stations. And I'm telling you, a year to my hire date, we had a couple thousand stations on the system, and we had a term sheet from Google for $1.28 billion or something. And I mean, boom. and then there's a whole story behind all that. I mean, I'll tell you what.
So you got to, it's not just the learning curve, it's also all those relationships, right? Like that relational capital that you brought to the table.
Absolutely. And look, there were a lot of things that took place. I learned more about leverage. I never really felt like I had extreme leverage like I did in that deal. And here's a few things that happened. So the first thing we realized when we did this deal is for this to work, there were 5 different companies that had hardware sitting in all the radio stations. And the automation system is it's the last piece that decides how every second is going to sound on the air. So it brings all the commercials and all the algorithm, what songs are going to play, and all the station mentions. It syncs all that up and points out all the holes and then what needs to be done with it. We talked to that because that's where we could see the inventory was unsold and we could fill it. And then we would split this revenue with the radio station, right? Well, we knew that was a leverage point that if we didn't own, they could use against us down the road. When they saw how valuable that connection was, they would want to charge us a percentage of that revenue. So part of that money that we raised, we went out and bought the largest 2 players that represented 70% of the marketplace. And then we just built in the connections we needed. By the way, I'm skipping a lot of stuff. Do you understand what we did, what DMARC did? So what DMARC did, there was a 3-year period that when you logged into your AdWords console, you could actually buy radio. It was called Google Radio. We powered that. Our technology allowed you to go to a marketplace, create a commercial, define the demographics or the radio format or the time, whatever. You would define different things that would then say, here's the list of stations that fit that criteria. And you could have that radio commercial on the air the very next day on numerous markets, right? But where it was really powerful and why we were able to get what we got was the fact that we could, for the first time ever, we had perfected, what do you call it? Direct response radio, right? I mean, you already had kind of direct response, but the thing is the feedback loop back then might be 30, 60, 90 days. And so you couldn't do fine tuning on the fly because it took you 30 days to negotiate it. It took you 30 more days to say, here's what played and what didn't play, trying to tie all that back together as to who played what when and did the campaign really work. Well, now all of a sudden we're in real time and you're looking at a control panel and it's saying this is playing now, this is playing now. We could insert dynamically call tracking numbers for every single market. Here's the copy that's playing. The system using an algorithm could say, this copy is actually working better. So the next time that commercial plays, replace it with this one, or this whole region of the country is not working, shut it down, play this instead, double up over in this region. I mean, all these things could be done that couldn't be done before because it was still archaic. I mean, literally what you hear on the air in the current day was decided 24 hours ahead of time and it was locked. There's no if-then statements at that point. It's manually said, Here's what's going to happen every second. And now it's locked and cannot be changed. With us tied into that system, we could make a change 3 seconds before it's about to air and say, nope, this is what you're playing instead, right? And now all of a sudden we can go to McDonald's and say, hey, I know you lock in your campaign for a whole quarter, but what about, if the temperature's above a certain range, we play this commercial. Like if it's over 90 degrees, we're going to play, milkshake commercials. And if it's below 50 degrees, we're going to play coffee commercials, right? That could never be done before. Or you go to the financial industry and say, if we're in a bull market, we'll play this commercial. If it's in a bear market, we'll pull all your stuff off. Or the pharmaceutical industry and say, if allergens are at a certain place, this is when we're going to promote the pharmaceuticals that are for allergies, not the other stuff. The same thing with plumber, or you could go to the air conditioning and guy and say, hey, we never know what the weather's going to be each day, but we know when it's hotter than hell, everybody wants air conditioning. And here's our price. And we will only play it when it's above 100 degrees in the marketplace. And so we could do all of that. And so for the first time, all of a sudden radio could see this opportunity of doubling their revenue. And we were testing it all on their unsold inventory.
The remnants, right?
Powerful. What's that?
On the remnants, right? Yeah, I mean, like
all the remnant. I mean, at that time, people were selling it as remnant for pennies on the dollar. We wouldn't even sell it as remnant because our algorithms could predict the reliability of how much of this we could get. And by pooling it together in a market, we didn't call it remnant. We knew historically what we could rely on, and we sold it as guaranteed revenue. And we were making more on it than what they were selling it in locally.